All right, we're recording.
Okay. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining our Q&A session about the Pollinators movie with two of the stars, Dr. James and Maryann Frazier. If you haven't seen the movie already, here's just a little bit of a background on it, the Pollinators documentary. It was released in 2019. It's a cinematic journey around the United States following migratory beekeepers and their truckloads of honeybees as they pollinate the flowers that become the fruits, nuts, and vegetables we all love to eat. The documentary was released digitally on June 16th, and if you haven't seen it, I urge you to stream it. While the film is focused on honeybees, they take a hard look at the pesticides that impact all pollinators. On June 16th, there was an article in the New York Times. It said, if the director, Peter Nelson, shows the weakness of current industrial farming models, he also shows agricultural alternatives by following experts in their fields, including the farmers and beekeepers whose livelihoods are at stake. The natural beauty of these specialist orchards does more than lend loveliness to dense information. It gives its audience a way to virtually understand agricultural health. I'll introduce you to our two special guests in just a moment, but before I do, I'd like to give you some background on Pollination Celebration and Bee City, USA. Asheville's Pollination Celebration celebrates National Pollinator Week and extends the week to the entire month of June. Just visit ashevillegreenworks.org to see a full list of events. My name is Phyllis Stiles, and I am the founder and director emeritus of Bee City, USA. I founded Bee City, USA in Asheville in 2012 and merged it with the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation in Portland, Oregon in 2018. You can visit beecityusa.org to learn all about the program, which now has more than 200 affiliates in 42 states. In 2017, Asheville Greenworks took leadership responsibility for our local Bee City, USA Asheville program. Greenworks Environmental Education Coordinator Peter Menzies here with us tonight, and I serve as co-chairs of Bee City, USA Asheville Leadership Committee, and some of our committee members are on this call. Peter is curating questions today. You want to say hello, Peter?
Hey everyone, my name's Peter. I'm the environmental educator at Asheville Greenworks. Thanks, Phyllis.
We'd like to take a moment. Okay, wait a minute. I did something wrong. Okay, we'd like to take a moment to highlight our sponsors for this year's Pollination Celebration. We owe a huge thank you to our platinum sponsor, Carolina Native Nursery, operating a wholesale and retail native plant nursery in Burnsville, North Carolina. Their Bee Native garden shop is now open, and you can visit at carolinanativenursery.com for more information. Would also like to thank Blackbird Frame and Art, Taco Billy, Tree of Life Potters, Town and Mountain Realty, and Reams Creek Nursery for offering financial support. These local businesses demonstrate their recognition of and value for the critical role pollinators and pollinator habitat have to play in Western North Carolina and globally. Finally, we'd like to thank everyone who registered for these events and in some cases made a donation. Any amount goes a long way in supporting our efforts to create and enhance native pollinator habitat. You can register for the remaining Pollination Celebration events at ashevillegreenworks.org. This movie is available for viewing through tomorrow, so you can go online and register for that. The pollinator photo contest continues through June 30th. We are getting amazing entries. The Pollination Ecologist webinar with author Tim Spira is on June 26th. You don't want to miss that. Or the other webinar from Lisa Wagner, who is a pollinator garden educator, on June 27th. So today we hope you'll type your questions in the chat box. If you're having trouble with Zoom, leave this session and go back to the link you started with and start over. This event and other Pollination Celebration events will be available as recordings. And if you want to get involved in Bee City USA Asheville, please contact Peter at ashevillegreenworks.org. All right, now the fun part. It's time to introduce our guests. Two of the stars of the Pollinator movie, Dr. Frazier and his wife, Maryann, reside in Mount Union, Pennsylvania with their dog, Sealy, named after Tom Sealy, if you all know about Tom Sealy, and lots of honeybee hives, where until last week, they owned and operated Singing Creek Farm. But they sold the farm so they could move, guess what, to Western North Carolina. And I have been lucky enough to meet the Fraziers on numerous occasions at pollinator-related conferences where they frequently make presentations. When the Fraziers speak, everybody listens because they know that they approach their work with knowledge and compassion. And before the coronavirus, we had planned to give them a grand introduction down here in Western North Carolina. So we'll just have to do that when they finally get here. Maryann Frazier kind of retired in 2016 after she served as a senior extension associate for 27 years at Penn State University. She was responsible for honeybee extension throughout Pennsylvania and cooperatively across the Mid-Atlantic region. She taught beekeeping, general entomology, and teacher education, and participated in the entomology department's innovative public outreach program. She continues to work with Penn State Center for Pollinator Research to research how pesticides impact honeybees and other pollinators. She also joined forces with Kenyan researchers to understand the impacts of newly introduced varroa mites on East African honeybee subspecies and to help Kenyan beekeepers become more productive. At some point, she found time to be assistant state apiary inspector in Maryland and a beekeeping specialist in Sudan and Central America. She earned her BS in agriculture education from Penn State University and a master's of agriculture in entomology, specializing in apiculture in 1983. And that was before beekeeping became so cool. She was way ahead of her time.
That's very true.
And then we have Dr. James Frazier. He's an insect physiologist with special interest in the structure and function of insect chemical senses, their roles in regulating feeding behavior, and the mode of action of insect antefeedants, and the impacts of pesticides on honeybees. He retired in 2015, and he served as head of Penn State's Department of Entomology from 1989 to 1999. Before that, he was senior research scientist and then research associate in the agricultural products department at E.I. DuPont Company from 1981 to 1989. He was also taught at Mississippi State University from 1970 to 1980, and he received his doctorate in entomology from the Ohio State University in 1970. Welcome, Jim and Maryann. We're so glad you're here. The virtual floor is yours. And I wonder if you'd like to make some opening statements. And you're welcome to pull up your PowerPoint. I'm going to stop sharing.
Okay, we'll do that. We'll go ahead and open ours. There we go. Okay. It's a pleasure to be here, to be with you. And I'm so sorry we're not with you in person. That is very unfortunate. We were looking forward to, we always look forward to visiting Western North Carolina. And we're very, very disappointed that we're not with you in person, but hopefully at some point we will be. So, we were very, very fortunate to be a part of this movie, The Pollinators. It is a wonderful production, and we we were able to participate in it right toward the end of our careers, right before we retired. I think you were already retired and I was about to retire. And so it was really a nice sort of end cap to our formal activities with the university. So I will just say that it has been an honor to be able to participate in the world of bees and beekeeping. I'm so pleased I've been able to make that my career, and honored to be a part of that particular production. So I'll turn the floor over to you, my dear.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here, and like Maryann, I echo our sentiments of sorrow of not being with you in person. I've been a practicing entomologist for 50 years, and I've been through several major changes in the field of entomology and in the fields of science as a whole. And it's amazing how that seems to all fit together in a perspective that has been useful in reflecting on the role of pollinators and the difficulties they're experiencing, and especially the role of pesticides in that. So I've given many talks about that topic through the national beekeeping organizations. And I just want to give you a little short capsule of that in a couple of slides here as an introduction to our question and answer period. Maryann and I were very fortunate to have been able to have a 3-person research team, along with Chris Mullen, who was an insect toxicologist. Chris is an outstanding insect toxicologist. He's a great chemist, and he was our mentor and teacher about the chemistry of pesticides. And with my background in physiology and behavior and Maryann's expertise in bees, the 3 of us were able to work together and ask some significant questions about honeybees and what pesticides were actually doing to them. And so for about 8 years, we did research together and have published a number of studies on that. So Maryann's going to lead off with a first couple of slides, and then I'll follow shortly afterwards.
We're going to keep this very short, very, very short, but we'll just give you a little bit of a, oops, there we go, a little bit of an introduction here. So I think a lot of people are well aware that honeybees are struggling and have been for quite some time. There are, as people I think also know, many factors that are involved in why bees are struggling. The one that we have really focused on was the issue of pesticides. But we know that there are other factors like varroa mites and queen quality and access to good quality forage, pathogens, location. There are lots of issues that bees are facing. And what we have really learned is that even this complement of issues that bees are facing may not be the same for every beekeeper. So, you know, new and say urban beekeepers may have this puzzle may be very different for them than it is for commercial migratory beekeepers. So it's part of what makes this whole issue of understanding what's happening to bees and why they're in decline so difficult, is because we have many different beekeepers keeping bees in many different ways. And of course we have bees beyond honeybees. We have native bees, solitary bees, and all of these different systems, different ways of keeping bees, different kinds of bees really are impacted in different ways by different kinds of factors. And so you can see here the puzzle pieces are different. The puzzle is complicated and it's different depending on many factors, including whether you're a long-time commercial migratory beekeeper or a new urban beekeeper. That's just 2 examples there. In addition, as I said, we really focused on pesticides, the issues around pesticides. And our work initially was to look at, well, are pesticides even a factor? Are they something that we really need to consider? So early on, whenever CCD first occurred, this sort of colony collapse disorder, and our recognition that pollinators were in trouble in 2007, 2008, we started to look for pesticides in samples of bee products and bees themselves. And lo and behold, there was no shortage of pesticides that bees were collecting, that we found in their pollen, in their not so much in honey, because so many pesticides are fat soluble, not liquid soluble, but certainly in the bees themselves and the pollen. We found a lot of different pesticides of all different types, including neonicotinoids, but not limited to neonicotinoids, insecticides, fungicides, herbicides, and other materials, metabolites, so things that break down products of these pesticides, as well as formulation materials that we also found could be problematic. So basically our work really did, I think, lay the groundwork very significantly for the fact that pesticides are an issue. Bees are being exposed to pesticides. And since that, there has been a lot of work done to demonstrate what kinds of impacts pesticides, how they're affecting bees, the many, 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 many ways that pesticides can really interfere with bees. So I'm going to turn that over. I'm going to give you that, and I'm going to turn that over to Jim. He has 3 slides, and then we'll get to your questions.
Well, another aspect that really contributes to the difficulty of not only doing research, but analyzing your situation as an individual beekeeper is that there are so many factors that are situation or context dependent. And one of those is the fact that honeybees forage at quite some distance for the colony. And about 95% of the time, they forage up to 6 kilometers, which is a 3.7-mile radius from the hive. And so you think about where you might have your bee colony located, but you're probably not thinking about a 6-mile radius around there in terms of what's available, what's blooming, or what's happening with agriculture or urban landscapes or the use of pesticides. And yet that's a very important component in terms of what the bees are being exposed to. If they're under nutritional stress, they will go even further, up to a 6-mile radius, and they can locate an optimal foraging site within about a 2-hour time frame. And so Dr. Seeley, who did some pioneering research on this, showed that if he changed a sugar bait station from one location to another, within 2 hours, they always found the optimal station and were able to communicate that to members of the colony and to focus their foraging on that site. Another factor is that when we hear about pesticide issues or see publications in the scientific community, the different countries have very different pesticide markets and not only forms of agriculture, which have a lot of things in common, but the use of pesticides is very different in different countries in the European Union, for instance, compared to the United States. The United Kingdom has about 300 registered active ingredients that are used in different pesticides. France has about 500 registered active ingredients. And most European countries are in this range of 400 to 500 different active ingredient chemicals in the products that are manufactured and sold there. But in the United States, we have over 1,200 active ingredients sold as 18,000 different pesticide products. And so the landscape is very different in the United States from what it is in the European Union. In addition to that, the way things are evaluated and the way the registration system works and how the regulatory system monitors that is also very different between the European Union and the United States. And I'd like to just end with this conceptual slide because it really tells us what we're faced with on an everyday situation, not only for our bees and functioning as beekeepers, but for citizens of the world. With 1,300 different active ingredients in pesticides and about 100 different formulation chemicals and about 1,000 natural products that are found in the pollen and the nectar of the plants that the bees forage on, there are some 60 to 80,000 industrial chemicals that have never been tested for human toxicity that are released into the environment through industrial processes. In addition to that, the newest class of chemicals of concern are grouped under pharmaceuticals and personal care products, which are passing through our water treatment plants into rivers and streams and groundwater that include antibiotics, reproductive drugs, and all sorts of things that have very high potency in terms of affecting biological systems. And these two, since our water treatment plants were never designed to deal with these, this is an unmitigated stream of chemicals going from our everyday activities out into the environment. And it's been accumulating for probably the last 50, 60 years without much monitoring going on. And so we've created a very chemically altered environment for ourselves and our bees and the animals and plants around us. And it's something that really needs to be addressed. But our government system is far from having a focus on this. So we know very little, probably just the very tip of the iceberg there, the data limits of things that we know about, and the vast majority, we know nothing about where these chemicals are, what they are, what their mixtures can do, what their formulation chemicals can do, or what combination of these might be doing to ourselves, our children, our grandchildren, our pets, our food source, our water source, and on and on. So it's not a pleasant picture, but it's a realistic one. Okay.
We're going to stop sharing, and we will turn it back over to you, Phyllis, for and Peter for the questions. Oops. Oh, we're not hearing you.
Phyllis, you're still muted.
Okay, I unmuted myself again. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Thanks so much for that introduction. It's pretty dire, but we do hope to end on some positive notes of some glimmers of hope out there. And I'm glad you got us started by showing that it's not the same around the world, that the way we treat our environment and the way we treat our pollinators in terms of pesticides is very different in different places in the world. So Peter, as you see questions come in the chat box, I hope that you'll chime in with those. And everybody, I want to remind you that down at the bottom of your screen, there is a chat box, and we hope that you'll submit your questions. Jim, I'm kind of curious to know what made you make the switch from working for DuPont, a chemical company, to move into academia. I think that would be helpful to know.
Well, it was kind of a fortuitous decision, but I'm one of the very few people who has been a university professor. I went through the academic ranks at Mississippi State University from assistant to associate to full professor. And then I left and went to DuPont as a senior research scientist. And I was at DuPont at a very interesting time period when they were quadrupling the size of their agricultural research enterprise, using biological scientists to put biological rationale onto directing the chemical synthesis program that could be the source of new pest control products. And they were doing this for the development of new fungicides, for new herbicides, and for new insecticides. And so I was one of the few senior scientists from the university. I was like the second person into this group. And then we hired another dozen scientists from around the country and joined those together with chemists working side by side on a daily basis to direct synthesis programs looking to discover new ways of controlling insects. And the program that I was involved with was working with natural products that had been isolated from plants around the world that impact insects by preventing them from feeding on those plants. The chemical ecology of plants is that they've evolved a battery of chemicals to deter feeding by all herbivores, whether they're deer or cattle or other animals, as well as insects. And so the chemical structure of these we use to look at the molecular basis of how these things might act. And in the case of what I was looking at, these were chemicals that interfered with the normal functioning of the taste receptors in plant-feeding insects. And so we were able to synthesize a product based on a portion of the structure of a natural chemical that would block the taste receptors of a caterpillar. And in the absence of that information, the caterpillar could be sitting on its host plant, but it would refuse to eat it and would starve to death. And so that was called an anti-feeding chemical. And it was the one research program in the agricultural products that was based on trying to control insects by behavioral manipulation rather than outright toxicity and killing them through a poisoning mechanism. So we demonstrated the principle that would work across different species lines. But at the time we did that in the 80s, the product that we might make could not compete economically with pyrethroid insecticides that were active at such small quantities. And so the biological principle that was put on the shelf, but I have no doubts that it will come off that shelf at some time in the future and will become a new mechanism of insect control.
But what brought you to the university?
So I had this really interesting experience at DuPont. We bought Shell's entire insecticide discovery group, moved 270 scientists from California to Wilmington and integrated them into the department. And I had a lot of management training courses, and I was at a point where as a research associate, I realized I could have stayed at DuPont and gone into management and would have probably spent the rest of my career there. And although it was exciting and very interesting work, I felt that my wide background in entomology was not being used in that particular job. And my friend Charlie Pitts, who was then head of the department at Penn State, called me up and said, "We're looking for a new department head. Knowing what I know about you, I think you'd really like the people here. Would you be willing to come and talk to us?" And I said, "Well, yes, I would." And so I went, and I really did like those people and realized that that job would let me do things that I was not going to be able to do at DuPont as a middle manager. And so I left industry and went back to the university campus and was very surprised to see how differently I saw an academic department, having spent 8.5 years in industry. And we used that viewpoint together with the faculty to completely redesign our graduate program. And I think it's really contributed to the long-term change of that department. So it was very rewarding for me to take the training that I got at DuPont, be able to go to Penn State, put that training into practice, watch the faculty and the students flourish, and feel like that was, my effort was time well spent.
And
So,
did that work lay the groundwork for the Center for Pollinator Research? Was there a tie-in there at Penn State?
Yes, absolutely, it did. It
Okay.
did.
And that's, for those of you who don't know it, the Center for Pollinator Research at Penn State is truly a national leader on all things pollinator, and particularly as it relates to agricultural production. So Jim, if you could just expand on that and just kind of give us a quick history of how we got to here. How did we become so dependent on pesticides for our agriculture?
Well, pesticides really started before World War II. Actually, some of the first pesticides used were arsenic compounds that we knew would poison all sorts of animals. In fact, when I went to Mississippi in 1970 in the land of cotton, where more than half of all the pesticides used in the United States every year were used to kill the boll weevil so that we could grow cotton, the byline was, if you want to grow cotton, you got to poison them bugs. And I was there when integrated pest management started as an alternative, substituting the knowledge of insect populations and the impact of beneficial insects on pest species, and using that knowledge to substitute for wholesale application of pesticides to minimize the risk of a pest insect developing and decimating a crop before the grower knew what was happening. And so the cost of having a cotton scout, someone who could go out and sample the cotton field and quantify the level of certain pest species and know that it was not necessary to apply a chemical until that population reached a certain level, that became a fundamental aspect of integrated pest management. And the savings of pesticide applications, which when I went there, there was probably 30 some applications of pesticides like methylparathion every year on a cotton crop. And through integrated pest management, that was cut in half. And so rather than spending all that money on pesticides, that money went into the grower's pocket, was able to pay for this cotton scout, and everybody came out ahead. So that's how integrated pest management found such a fertile application and spread from cotton to all major crops, and has become, for the last 40 years, the mainstay of our approach to pest control in crop production and even animal pest control throughout the United States and the world.
All right, thanks, Jim. We have a couple.
I know we have a couple of questions. Where I was going to go next was just to walk us through, we all know about DDT and then bringing us on up to neonics. But if your questions fit better at this point, we can save that. What do you think?
We have some questions that are relevant to pesticides. If we want to address that.
Well, go ahead. You go ahead with your questions, and we can come back around to sort of getting how in the world did we get to where we are today?
Okay. So what are the most critical regulatory and/or industrial changes you argue for to improve the situation? Are there agribusiness leaders who might serve as models to improve the situation?
Well, I think the ball is already rolling in the direction of more sustainable agricultural production systems. Locally grown, locally produced food that's sold through farmers markets and other kinds of cooperative efforts has really been gaining for the last 20 years, especially if it's organically produced. I think ironically, with the COVID virus situation that we've had here, a lot of people in cities have seen the wisdom of being able to grow some of your own food or being closer to places where the food is grown. And so I think it's really adding momentum to a sustainable food production system for which there are many, many changes that could be introduced. Some of those have started through the organic growing situation that's been developing for the last 20 some years and gaining strength every season. And the food poisoning problems that we have, you know, the problems with bacterial contamination of a lot of large scale processed foods is not from the growing standpoint, but from the transport and processing levels that are in between. And so large factory farm production systems that feed large sorting and packing and transport systems that produce food in the local market that's traveled an average of 2,000 miles before it gets there, using lots of energy that doesn't really need to be used. There are a lot of reasons that a more locally grown and produced and consumed food would make sense. And so the die is cast, the momentum is building, and I think that's our future on the doorstep.
Thanks, Peter. Did you have another question that would be good right now?
Let's see. No, not right now.
Okay. Well, before we switch to Maryann, because with a 27-year history and extension, I would love to hear how that work has changed over her 27 years. But if you could just briefly kind of summarize how we went from the arsenic in cotton fields up to the present day pesticides, just, you know, hit the highlights. Either one of you, I think that would be helpful for this conversation.
Yeah, I can take a stab at that. I mean, World War II allowed the production in the beginning of synthetic pesticide production, where chemicals were, some of them were produced as wartime chemicals. Mustard gas was toxic, and the industry started looking at other uses of those materials or side products of those. During World War II, DDT was used for pest control for ticks and mites and fleas. And I once heard a talk given by one of the National Academy toxicologists saying that in terms of numbers of lives saved, DDT was the most beneficial chemical ever produced by mankind.
So I don't know what changed, but there's some kind of interference with the sound, Jim. We can't hear now. There's
really?
a fuzzy sound breaking up.
Well, nothing's changed at our end. I'm not sure what's going on.
Okay, well now I can understand you.
Okay. So that was before we recognized that DDT bioaccumulates in the food chain and leads to difficulty with egg shell thinning for birds. And that led to the development of the EPA with Rachel Carson's book, raising the flag for everyone to recognize how common pesticides were in the environment. And the EPA then came into existence in the early 70s and was very instrumental in changing the way in which pesticides were evaluated before they could be marketed. That was followed by the Food Quality Protection Act, which mandated that things had to be done and tested not by third parties, because those third parties were found to be corrupt in many instances, And so the onus came on the pesticide companies to be able to generate data that the EPA could use to test for the safety of things. That worked well through several generations of pesticides that were sprayed on the crops. But then when the neonicotinoid class came along relatively late in the sequence here in the early 1990s, they were systemic pesticides that could be applied to the roots or on the surface of plants that would go inside the plant and be transported. They were water soluble rather than fat soluble. And the whole regulatory system was not developed to test systemic pesticides. And so they were given approval prematurely without adequate testing and have resulted in many of the consequences that we're dealing with now as a result of having been inadequately evaluated at the very beginning. And so now they become the largest used pesticides in the world. The neonicotinoid class is used everywhere worldwide. It's become ubiquitous in the environment. And we're now at the point of having neonicotinoid contamination in the environment and in our bodies in the same way that DDT was in the early 1970s. So we've come full circle in terms of not understanding the consequences for the use of a given class of pesticide that is being used in such large quantities and so often throughout the world. So we've made progress in some ways and we've lost ground in others.
So just talking about neonic's impact on the pollinators, can you talk about the adverse impacts?
Well, yeah, the neonicotinoids are particularly toxic to bees. It was thought in the beginning that because they were inside the plant, that was not going to be an issue until it was realized that as they circulate within the plant, whenever the plant blooms, that those chemicals get transported to the pollen and the nectar in the bloom. And regardless of when the plant was exposed to the systemic pesticide, if it was exposed very early in the growing season, later in the season when it blooms, it will have that toxic material in the blooms. And so if there's spray that drifts from, or a dust that drifts from the planter when treated corn seeds are planted, if that dust drifts onto plants in the border of the field or beyond, then all of those plants will become contaminated with the systemic neonicotinoid. And whenever they bloom throughout the season, will be a source of exposure for pollinators. And so rather than having a short-term exposure for a sprayed-on chemical that could only last on the surface of the plant for a certain amount of time because ultraviolet light and other things would break it down, this neonicotinoid class has turned into a season-long exposure well beyond the borders of the fields in which it's being used. And so that has many consequences for the biological components of the environment in all of the earth.
And so what is the impact on bees, for example? What does it do to them?
Well, the other component of the use, which has made it so difficult from a research standpoint, when we had highly toxic pesticides like parathion or the pyrethroids that were highly toxic, but they were not long lasting in the environment. If the bees were active when the material was sprayed and the bees got that spray on them, they would die in large quantities within the next few days, and there would be piles of dead bees in front of the colony. It was very obvious that there'd been a pesticide poisoning incident. And we never worried about what happens when the amount of that pesticide in the environment is less than a dose that will kill 99% of the population, because they were designed to be used at a level that would kill all of the pest insects. And if the bees happened to get in the way, they would all get killed. But it was only for a short period of time, and then it was no longer in the environment. But with the neonicotinoids, they persist in the plant for months, and in the soil for years, and in the groundwater for years, so that the concentration that bees can be exposed to can be very low or a sublethal level. And the consequences of that long-lasting exposure to a low level has brought into a whole new realm of biological activity that we've only begun to understand in the last 5 to 10 years. research-wise, and there's been a veritable explosion of scientific literature, 500 or more papers a year on sublethal impacts of pesticides on pollinators every year for the last 5 years. And we're learning multiple ways in which these can negatively impact not only honeybees and the colony dynamics, but solitary bees and other insects and other animals in the environment, from invertebrates in the soil to other insects and watering systems to the entire food chain in the environment at large. So it's a complicated but far-reaching impact that has been documented to the point that many scientists, and especially the European Union, are calling for the banning of the use of these materials until we can understand what their impact is in the environment.
So I might just jump in here for a minute and say something about the sublethal effects of pesticides, what that might look like. So for instance, bees might not be able to navigate. They might not be able to find their way home. They might interfere with their ability to feed the larvae. Their hyperpharyngeal glands that they use to produce brood food might be impacted. So it's much more subtle than just, outright killing the bees, being toxic to them. And this is part of the reason why it's been so hard to sort of get at the impacts of neonicotinoids, because they are these more, I mean, they can kill outright, but they're like when dust from corn is involved, but they're much more likely to have sublethal effects, which have been much more difficult to get at. And there's lots and lots of kinds of sublethal effects.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you both. Peter, any questions before I ask Maryann a question?
So here's one related to, I guess, like pesticide accumulation. Is there anything like collation, like a collation process that might help reduce the aggregated toxins?
Well, chelation is one mechanism that biological systems can use, or they could be used to help clear soil and water contamination. And it's something that if that capacity were added to water treatment plants, that would be of great benefit in removing that chemical pollution from the fluid stream, for which they're not now designed to do that. So that's certainly one mechanism that could be used, absolutely.
Okay, thanks. So Maryann, you must have seen it all over 27 years. How did your role with the farming community change in those 27 years? Did you see any kind of radical change in how farmers were farming, and what kind of questions were they asking you? It's a wide open question. I'd just be curious to hear your answer.
Right. So most of my work has been with beekeepers, and I have to say that there's been a tremendous change in beekeeping and beekeepers in the 30 odd years. I mean, it's 26 years at Penn State, but I was also involved with bees and beekeeping for like almost 10 years before that. So I've seen a lot of change. Of course, varroa mites, before I was involved with beekeeping before we had varroa, which was a wonderful time to keep bees, and it was a lot less complicated than it is now, certainly. So varroa arriving on the scene has certainly created a lot of change. We lost a lot of beekeepers. But interestingly enough, the whole declining honeybee population that was sort of initiated by CCD has actually brought a lot of new beekeepers to the field of beekeeping. And a lot of women, a lot of young people, which is a lot of urban people wanting to get involved with bees and beekeeping and helping bees, which has been really exciting and interesting, because prior to that, most beekeepers were older men, and they were all concerned about what's going to happen whenever we're no longer able to continue on with keeping bees, and who's going to be there for the farmers to pollinate the crops, to get the bees out to the crops that need bees for pollination. So that has changed a lot. Beekeeping itself, who's keeping bees and how they're kept, has really changed a lot in the last 30 years, 35 years.
the farmers, those people who are in need, particularly of bees for pollination, you know, farmers have got to be well educated today. You cannot be a farmer and not be very savvy and very smart and very knowledgeable and up to date on farming techniques. So farmers really are very, I would say, worked hard at being knowledgeable about the practices of farming. And they get their information from lots of different places. You know, they have associations, they have journals, they have meetings, very well attended, high information, high impact type meetings. But they also get a lot of their information, and extension people are very involved in those meetings. But, you know, extension is really, sad to say, losing a lot of funding. And so what extension researchers, extension specialists would be engaged in research, would look at chemicals, would assess them independently, and often be able to be a voice, a very independent voice, a voice that didn't have there was no predestined interest in what, you know, whether the chemical
conflict of
interest, that's the word I'm trying to think. That's why there's two of us here. There was no conflict of interest. So it was an independent voice. Now farmers get a lot of their information from pesticide representatives in the field, marketing people, and their job is to sell chemicals. And so oftentimes farmers are relying on this information from chemical reps to, you know, to tell them what to do, when to spray. And this has been a bit of a problem because they really don't have another voice or another set of information oftentimes to go to determine whether or not this is the best option for them in terms of controlling their pests and not doing harm, particularly to pollinators. Now, farmers that are reliant on bees for pollination, I would say, are trying pretty hard. They're aware that there's a problem. I mean, they're dependent on those bees, whether they're depending on native bees or on rented honeybees for pollination. You know, that's critical to them for the yield, for the production of their crops. So they're much more likely to be paying attention, be knowledgeable, be concerned about what they're actually putting on their crops and how it's going to affect the pollinators that are there trying to do the job of pollination. I don't know if that answers your question or if that's what you were looking for or not, but.
Well, while Peter's thinking about if he's got a question, my follow-up question to that was, how many commercial beekeepers are there in the country? Any idea?
So there are about between 200 and 250,000 beekeepers in the US. The vast majority of those, probably 200,000, are hobby beekeepers, or beekeepers with less than 5 hives each. There's probably about 10,000 of them that are sideline beekeepers that have maybe 50 to 100 or 200 colonies. And there's probably less than 2,000 beekeepers who are large commercial beekeepers, but they own the largest number of colonies. And those are the colonies that are trucked from one place to the next for the purposes of pollination. The majority of those beekeepers are dependent on mainly pollination for their income, honey production as well, but most of those large commercial beekeepers are engaged in multiple pollination of multiple crops across the country.
So we have several questions here about honeybees. So could the apiary industry raise enough bees to allow them to sort of work in, quote, shifts, thus allowing one cohort to rest from taking in toxins for an interval before being placed with the new client farm, i.e. bees clear toxins in a brief enough period to intermittently be used?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it is exactly what beekeepers, particularly large commercial beekeepers, are now trying to do. What they'll do is they used to take the bees from one crop to the next, being exposed to, allowing those bees to be exposed to pesticides, time after time again. Now, a lot of them take a break between pollination contracts. They take them they like to take, a lot of them in the West like to take them to conservation lands, to BLM lands, where they can recover from pesticide exposure. So yeah, that is a technique that is being used by lots of beekeepers to try to give the bees a break from the exposure.
Peter, did you have another one?
Yeah, we have another one about beekeeping. Could you tell us more regarding why the queens need to be replaced so often, and how do you raise supplementary queens?
Okay, so yeah, one of the problems that a lot of beekeepers will tell you we're having is problems with queen. So queen, of course, is the one reproductive female in the colony. She's very critical to the survival of the colony, the welfare of the colony, and how well a colony performs in terms of honey production or reproduction, producing more bees. So she's very, very critical. And in the last, gosh, it's been for quite some years, we've had problems with colonies. The queens, bees themselves, the workers, will live for a very short period of time during the productive season, about 6 weeks. Queens can live 2 years, 3 years, sometimes 4 or 5 years. They can live much longer. But what we've been noticing is that they don't live as long. The colonies have difficulty replacing them, and they are often not replaced at all. And in cases when they're not replaced at all, that just basically leads to the demise of the colony. So beekeepers can produce queens. They can take colonies and they can remove the queen and encourage the bees to rear queens under controlled condition and rear a lot of queens, which then those beekeepers can sell to beekeepers who need queens. But there is, like with many things, there's often a price to pay when you're rearing large numbers of queens, and there's a huge demand and a small supply. There's a lot of pressure on the people who are producing those queens, and sometimes quality could suffer, and the queens may be rushed to be sent off to be put in, head up colonies because there's such a strong demand. And so it used to be that queens were evaluated very carefully before they were sent off to beekeepers for their colonies. And now that doesn't always happen because there's such a demand for them. So that is contributing to potentially why queens quality is not what it could be, or what it should be. And there are other factors as well, but we think that's one of them, that there's so much demand. And of course, when you have a high demand, there's a lot of pressure, and the supply is low, to produce new ones oftentimes results in poor quality.
So you're saying the queens just ain't what they used to be.
Right. That's what seems to be the case. A lot of beekeepers complain about that. And what role pesticides play in that is hard to say. It is potentially possible. Again, we know that pesticides can impact bees' memory and their learning and their navigation. So these queens that are getting fed a lot of food, because that's what happens. That's what when you're going to be a queen, you get lots and lots of food. Are they getting more pesticide when they go out, when they leave the hive to mate? In some cases, are they not able to find their way back to their hive? It's a potential sublethal effect of pesticides.
Yeah, we also know that neonicotinoids can impact the hypopharyngeal gland development in nurse bees. There is an acetylcholine receptor in the hypopharyngeal glands that neonicotinoids will bind to outside the nervous system. And so that action is the equivalent of a hormone disrupting action of neonicotinoids. And it's been shown that will lead to altering the functioning of the hypopharyngeal glands, which alters the quality of the royal jelly and the larval food that the nurse bees produce, and can result in decreased queen quality as well as interfering with normal survival of the larvae.
In the movie, they showed trucks that had bee food, feed written on the side of them. And then they were using hoses to pour that food into the hives. What is that food?
So that would be sugar. That would be sugar, liquid sugar. So sugar, granulated white sugar, or high fructose corn syrup in some cases, mixed with water. So when nectar is basically sucrose that bees consume, and very, very diluted sucrose that they consume, and then they remove a lot of the moisture, add enzymes to that, and turn it into honey. So basically, bees' diet, particularly the adults, is sugar, is sugar syrup. And so the beekeepers can actually feed the bees on sugar syrup that they can make themselves. And so that's what that food is.
And so is that as good as natural nectar?
I would have said no for years and years and years. And then I saw a very interesting presentation. I'm not going to remember who it was that gave it, but at Apimundia by the Canadians. They are stripping the bees of all their honey in the fall and feeding them on sugar syrup to get them through the winter. So they know exactly how much they need, and they feed that amount. And they seem to be quite successful at overwintering these colonies on basically on sugar syrup. And so my gut is to say no, it's not as good, but I'm not sure I have the evidence to say it's not as good. I think that there's a lot of interesting questions there about sugar and it's whether it's the best for bees as opposed to honey that they would make themselves from the nectar of flowers.
Yeah. We had another question about the movie. It talked about splitting hives being very challenging for commercial beekeepers to keep up with demand, and how unsustainable that was. Could you speak to that?
So that's what a lot of the beekeepers, when they lose their hives over the winter, and many of them lose large numbers of them, what they do is they take the remaining hives and they split them to make up their losses. And then they feed them. They feed them like crazy to get them to build up. And, it's a lot of work for the beekeeper. It's a huge effort to do that. And it's hard on the bees to be split, and then fed and fed and fed, and then be exposed to pesticides and be trucked around. It's a lot of stress on the colonies. There is an advantage. We know that splitting colonies does help reduce varroa mite numbers. And so that's an advantage of splitting. But in general, for the beekeeper as well as the bees, this continued splitting of colonies, it would, the beekeepers have been able to go at it for a long period of time, which surprises us. At this point, I would have thought that they but I think what happens is we get good years, we get bad years. So there's more splitting on the bad years, and then the bees do recover, have a good year, and then the beekeepers can recover as well. But it doesn't seem that it's going to be sustainable over the long term, this constant splitting and pushing an organism to its brink, to as hard as we can to squeeze everything we can out of it in terms of honey production and pollination. It just would not appear to be sustainable in the long term.
We have a question from the audience. Going back to the sugar water being fed to the bees, can you treat the sugar water to help chelate toxins?
Well, the difficulty there is that if you treat it with a chelator, it's going to chelate things other than toxins, minerals and so forth that the bees might need metabolically. And so it would have to be, it's not just that simple to treat the water. It's a good idea, but the practice would be more difficult. I should say that one of the things that has happened recently that is not well understood or recognized is that because there's been a 30 to 40% loss of bees on an annual basis, the beekeepers have had to make up for that loss by splitting their colonies and developing new colonies. We estimated, based on the number of colonies lost over a 5-year period, that the beekeeping industry made up for $2.1 billion in loss by splitting and replacing bees that they had lost. And that was done without any outside input to help them recover from that cost. That's how hard economically the beekeeping industry has been impacted in order to provide sufficient numbers of bees for pollination in almonds, which is the largest pollination event in the world that happens February of every year, and then all the other successive crops across the US that follow upon that. So the beekeepers have pushed themselves to the point of exhaustion and to the point of succumbing in several cases. They're multiple generation family business beekeepers, large ones, who've gone out of business in the last few years because of the economic consequences of this difficult situation we've been in for the last 10 years. Most people don't even recognize that that's been going on.
Peter, do you have another question?
That's all we got for right now.
Okay. So can we talk a little bit about the other bees, mostly the other bees, they're the pollinator workhorses. Maryann, I know that you have done some work with native bees, and I'm sure that Jim has some thoughts on that too. Where do you see the bright spots where we're actually taking advantage of our native bees to help with pollination? Are there any breakthroughs?
It's interesting. A lot of people don't recognize how many native bees we have. There are thousands of species of native bees in the United States and tens of thousands worldwide. And so lots and lots of other kinds of bees. And some of those species have been used for managed pollinators, like bumblebees, for instance, in greenhouses. Osmia bees, which are a mason type bee. The female builds, each individual builds her own nest, lays her own eggs. Those bees are particularly good pollinators of Rosaceae, which includes apples, for instance. So there are a few other species that are managed. And one of the things that's happened with the honeybee decline is that there is a lot more attention on and funding for research on native bees. And we're trying harder to understand how to improve the habitat for native bees. And anything that we do to improve the environment, the habitat, the protection from pesticides for native bees is also going to be good for honeybees, and vice versa. So, you know, there's a little bit of a contention sometimes between the honeybee people and the native bee people, but in reality, what we do for one, we also benefits the other. And so there is, and I think that by using some native bee species or trying to improve the environment around orchards, say, to be able to depend more on native bees, take some of the pressure off of honeybees. If they don't have to be there to pollinate every crop every time, and we can improve the habitat and natural numbers of native bees, it's only going to be a good thing. You know, it's only going to be helpful. So yeah, there is a lot of interest in that, and there's a lot of effort in that arena, and we're happy to see that.
Well, and you give me a good segue. An important point that the movie made was about the apple industry and how we as consumers want perfect, beautiful, big apples. And so the practice of using Sevin dust to support the king bloom and to get rid of all of the other blooms is it appeared in the film is pretty common. And so maybe you could talk about that and elaborate on what we saw in the movie and that issue of how we as consumers are driving a lot of this pesticide use because we have such high expectations for perfect produce.
That's correct.
Yeah. Do you want to?
Well, yeah, I mean, the apple tree will produce a lot more apples than the growers allow it to do because they want larger fruit. And so insecticide 7 is used to thin the apples after bloom and after pollination takes place. And so a fresh fruit market for apples is the high dollar value crop. And so everybody wants to produce the prime perfect apple for that high value market, and everything less than that can be sold for apple juice and cider and other kinds of production at a fraction of the cost. And so it's really the demand for the perfect fruit that is driving all of the effort to produce that blemish-free apple for the marketplace. So if consumers were willing to have apples that had some blemishes on them at a reduced price, they could increase the availability of those kinds of apples in the marketplace. And the ultimate, well, it's kind of ironic that the ultimate force that will change agriculture is the consumer who buys food in the marketplace. How you choose to spend your dollar has immediate feedback on what the producers will do in terms of what they want to grow. And so if you choose to spend your food dollars on things that are produced sustainably or organically, then that's what's going to increase in the marketplace. And that's what's been happening to a large extent for the last 20 years. And so consumers have the ultimate power if they will make informed decisions and act in mass to produce market pressure in the direction they'd like to see changes made.
So in that vein, when we think about the organic produce that we're buying, how are they achieving that? If it's so hard to get that beautiful apple with no blemishes, when we buy an organic apple, how did they do it?
Well, I can't answer that entirely because I'm not that familiar with total organic apple production, but I know that sulfur is used a lot in organic production, and sulfur is not without environmental consequences, but that's not something that we really are focused on. So
I think that too, organic produce, organic fruits and vegetables sometimes cost more, than conventionally produced. And it's because they might use other kinds of mechanisms that are more labor intensive, scouting, sometimes even hand picking insects off of, I mean, it depends on what the crop is, to achieve the kind of insect control that they need to have to be able to sell something organically. So, and a lot of times organic fruit will have blemishes, will have evidence of insect or pathogen damage. And so it's again, like Jim said, consumers that always only pick the perfect apple or the perfect ear of corn without a corn earworm are saying to the growers, we basically want this kind of product. We want you to use a pesticide because this is the product that we're going to buy. And so, and if, again, we can control the narrative, we can control what we're saying to the growers by being willing to accept fruits and vegetables that are not necessarily perfect, that might have a little bit of insect damage, might even have a corn earworm. To me, I look for those ears because I know that there's less pesticide being used in those ears of corn that have the corn earworm, and I just cut it out, which is what everybody used to do before we had systemic pesticides. So we do have a lot more power than we think. And there are a lot of young farmers who are trying hard to make it, and they're very conscious of the use of pesticides, wanting to produce a good product, wanting to market directly to consumers, and they're, you know, meeting their consumer face to face. They got to have a good product that is safe for those consumers. And so buying from farmers markets, buying from CSAs, I think that really is very, very, very valuable. And I think more, you know, would be very helpful if more of us would do that.
But what do you say to those people that say the only way we're going to feed our growing population in the world, all the billions of people that are being added, is by this heavy synthetic input industrial agriculture? What's your answer?
Well, my answer is that's the industrial model for agriculture, but the vast majority of the world does not have an industrial agricultural model. It does not rely on less than 5% of the population to feed 95% of the population. Many more people are involved in agriculture and food production the way we used to be in this country. So it can provide a viable career option for people to be involved in growing food directly on the land using alternative approaches like row covers and high tunnels and augmentation of beneficial insects to control other insect pests, resistant varieties, rotation of crops, soil management. There's lots of tactics that can be used to reduce insect pest pressure and disease pressure to produce quantities of fruit that are equivalent to what can be done on a mass scale, where wholesale use of pesticides is the tactic for reducing risk when people cannot be there for the amount of time that it takes to do that in an alternative way. So I think there's lots of opportunity for us to become more sustainable and more in tune with the natural systems in which food is produced that will be situation dependent wherever in the world that's accomplished.
And I would say too that model that you just described, Phyllis, is very true if we want cheap food. If we want food that is, our food is so cheap in this country that we could achieve a lot in terms of safer food, healthier food, a healthier environment, if we were willing to pay more for our food so that farmers could make a decent living and we wouldn't have to, and they could be more diversified. We could have smaller farmers in our communities who produced a lot of our food. Now this, it might be different for grain farmers and for, food that we need large quantities of, like corn, for instance, and soybeans. But certainly for fruits and vegetables, it is very doable to have that food produced in our communities, again, if we are willing to pay what it's worth.
The other major component of that is we view food as cheap because we only associate the cost of actually purchasing the food. The environmental cost of how that food was produced has been neglected for generations. The accumulating chemical pollution in the environment is a consequence of how we've been producing food, and everyone wants to forget that it's happening, so no one is responsible for that cost, when in fact, sooner or later, that cost is going to come home to roost. So our idea of food as costly only from what we pay at the market is a very incomplete formula, and one that is no longer going to be allowed. We've saturated our environment to the point where we're going to be forced to do something about it.
So you say we're going to be forced. What is the tipping point? What is going to make us change? And I'm trying to get to those glimmers of hope. Where is it happening?
Yeah, I mean, in the United States, our regulatory system operates on the basis of, if something was approved for use and it doesn't work as we intended, we'll get feedback that there are negative impacts and we'll adjust the system. In the European Union, the opposite philosophy is the precautionary principle. If we don't understand and can't predict the impact of something, we shouldn't be using it in the environment until we reach that point. So there's a much more cautious approach to releasing and using things than there is in the United States. So somewhere between those two extremes is the right approach. The European Union, with fewer chemicals and stricter regulations and willingness to ban the use of things, is certainly far ahead of us from environmental stewardship standpoint than we currently are in the United States.
I don't want to put you on the spot, but that makes me think about glyphosate and how now there are, you know, lawsuits about people developing cancer as a result to their exposure to glyphosate. And
Right.
it's a hotly debated subject on, you know, the science of all of that.
Right.
And so feel free to say you'd rather not get into that because that's a long conversation, but I wondered if you had any response to.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think glyphosate is just the first example, because it was such a widely used herbicide, that became so prevalent in the environment and in our food system and then in our bodies, that we're forced to recognize that there are health consequences that result from that. Those 60 to 80,000 industrial chemicals that are out there that are also in the water and in our food supply and in our bodies have never been looked at from a research standpoint to understand the potential health consequences. I think glyphosate is just the first of a very long list of things that our bodies are being insulted with that will come to the forefront as science can progress. But there's lifetimes of research to be done to understand that situation, and we've let our use of chemicals get way ahead of where we should be in terms of understanding how to use them safely and expeditiously, with human health at the top of that list of importance.
And haven't some European countries banned glyphosate for its cosmetic use in parks and such?
Yeah, but that's only the tip of the iceberg. It's only just beginning. They're
Right.
actually farther along with neonicotinoid banning than they are with glyphosate.
And so is that a case where maybe it will have to be because of the lawsuits that something changes?
Well, that's the ultimate pressure that will drive it. But if we were more forward thinking in terms of how we approach our farming system to be compatible with the biological realities of our environment and to be sustainable and to allow the people who engage in that production a viable lifetime enterprise, and recognize that if they are supported to do that, that the long-term health of the environment will be maintained and even improved, that's a worthwhile investment that should be part of the cost that we associate with high quality, nutritious, and safe food. So that's an alternative approach to the way we allow things to happen now. So there are many choices to be made.
Right. And so you said earlier that it's really in our power as consumers to instigate those changes. And so are we looking to the consumers to make that happen rather than, or not in concert with the EPA and the USDA and, you know, leading government agencies?
Well, I mean, you know, we have a republic that is supposed to be a functioning democracy, and the strength of a democracy is only as good as the informed citizenry who vote. And so being informed and understanding the situation and then insisting that decisions be made based on the reality of the situation through public policy, through laws that are regulated, through regulatory agency functioning, through the economic consequences of our enterprise, are all things that we as citizens have a role to play and the ultimate power to see that it's done the way we'd like to have it done. We just have to become active, become educated, and insist that the right things be done.
Peter, you've been quiet for a while. Anything coming through the chat box?
Yeah, so we have some questions kind of going back to honeybees. Now's a good time for that.
Yeah.
Let's see. So in terms of, the many forces acting against honeybees, do the bees develop adaptations to all of them, genetic changes, natural selection, et cetera?
So yeah, we know that insects can actually develop resistance very quickly to pesticides. So that's unfortunate whenever you're trying to control insect pests because they develop resistance and then you have to find new pesticides, new ways of killing them. But honeybees also can develop resistance and probably do have resistance to certain kinds of chemicals that they've been exposed to in the past. So yeah, they can. But again, what happens is because the pest insects are developing resistance, we're constantly searching for new chemicals with different modes of action. And honeybees are insects. And so these are beneficial insects we're trying to save while at the same time trying to control the pest insects. So it's a very tricky situation. But yes, honeybees do have the ability to adapt to a certain degree, particularly when we're talking about issues with pesticide and even varroa mites. We know that Africanized bees, African honeybees, have more capabilities to resist mites than do European honeybees. We've learned that. So yeah, they do have the capability to adapt.
And there's efforts to produce those resistant lines.
Mm-hmm. And we do have one of our ways of trying to control or trying to help the bees to resist the mites is to select for resistant lines of honeybees.
Thank
Is
you.
there anything else?
Yeah, so we got one going back to the discussion of queens. How does one evaluate a queen?
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
So it's pretty straightforward. The queen is it's all about the quality of the queen is all about her ability to lay eggs. So what a queen breeder will do is put a queen in a colony, a small colony, and basically assess how many eggs she lays, how quickly she lays the eggs, and how many of those survive. So when I say survive, I mean that sometimes the queen can lay eggs that are not all workers, that she'll lay drones. And so sometimes she'll lay those drone eggs, which are not fertilized, in worker cells, and then the workers will recognize those and remove them. So we don't want a lot of that. We don't want them to do a lot of that. We want them to lay nice solid pattern, nice solid, in this case, frames, which have cells that are for workers. And we want those cells to be laid up very quickly and to be all workers and to be have to be done quickly. So it's all about how many eggs how many worker eggs the queen can lay, for instance, in a day. And some queens, they're not well mated, so they end up not laying very fertilized eggs, which result in workers. They end up being drones. Or again, the queen can even be well mated sometimes and lay not all worker cells, and she doesn't lay them very well. She goes all over the frame, lays some here, lays some there. So she's losing a lot of time. So basically it's all about checking on the queen in a day and seeing how much brood she produces in a short period of time.
And so the ideal situation is if the queen is mated with 10 to 20 drones to get her lifetime supply of sperm, which she stores.
Jim, we can barely hear you. Something adjusted on your computer and it covered up the microphone.
Is that better?
Better.
Okay, so the ideal situation would be for the queen to mate with 10 to 20 different drones during her mating flight to get her lifetime supply of sperm, which she stores inside. And that would allow her to lay 1,000 or more eggs every day through her lifetime of several years to benefit the colony. So that's the ultimate queen.
Boy, that Queen Elizabeth isn't much of a queen, is she?
Not compared to that.
We have one more question from the audience. Are clothes treated with insecticides a good alternative to wearing bug spray?
A good alternative, clothes treated with insecticide, an alternative to using bug spray, like off or something like that on your body.
Repellent,
Yeah.
I don't really know.
Yeah, I don't think I should make a stab at that either. I don't honestly know much about the clothes impregnated with pesticides. I don't think I personally would want to wear clothes impregnated with pesticides up against your skin. I just don't think that would be a good alternative. Everything's a risk assessment. When you go into the woods here, you don't want to be bitten by ticks. And so we do sometimes put pesticides on our clothes, around our ankles, or on our hat, that kind of thing. But in terms of wearing clothing that was completely impregnated with pesticide, myself, I don't think I'd feel very comfortable doing that.
Yeah, I'd rather use DEET as a repellent sprayed on a hat brim than putting it on. Certainly wouldn't put it on my skin. And if I'm going to put it on, I would put it on the outside of clothing that could then be removed and cleaned afterwards.
You guys, my clock shows 8:26 and we're supposed to end at 8:30. So it would be great, Maryann, if maybe you could just tell us something about your experience in Africa and how that's giving some good ideas for what we can do to improve bee health in the United States. Just that sharing of knowledge sounds like that might be pretty inspiring.
Yeah, it's been very, very inspiring for me. I worked in Sudan in the mid 80s. I worked in Sudan with bees and beekeepers. And one of the things that I recognized then was that we saw very little brood disease in Sudan when we worked with the African bees in Sudan. And that always fascinated me. And so when we had a chance to go back to Africa here basically our first trip back to Kenya was 2010, 2009, I think, actually. Yeah. We had a grant, we went to Kenya. One of the things I was really interested in finding out was whether or not this observation was more general with African bees. And we asked our colleagues before we went whether or not they had issues with varroa mites, and they said, no, we don't have varroa mites here. And we said, oh, that's interesting. Well, we talked to them here in the United States. And when we got there, we found out they did have varroa mites. Every colony had varroa mites everywhere we looked. And it was fascinating because they didn't recognize that they had them. In other words, they weren't causing damage. They weren't killing the colonies. And so it led us to do a fair amount of research over the next 10 years, looking at both, the research that had been done before, which was pretty thin, and doing research of our own particularly on the issues around diseases and mites, monitoring and surveying and for viruses and mites and nosema. And it appeared that the African bees really, really were capable of tolerance and resistance, I would say, to things like mites and nosema and viruses. And it would be nice to do some follow-up from those initial surveys that, it's been almost 10 years since we've done that. But these bees are very, very, very different in some ways than it is the same species of honeybee, but they have evolved in a very, very different environment and very different way of beekeeping, which is basically, those are wild bees. They're wild bees that the beekeepers put up receptacles for and make a little bit of honey, and then the bees leave and migrate during the dry season. So there's a lot of migration of the bees, a lot of movement of bees, a lot of swarming reproduction of bees, and these characteristics have actually resulted, we think, in a much healthier population of bees, one that is able to deal with, if you will, something as devastating as varroa mites much more effectively than our bee population. And so it's been fascinating to compare the two systems, our bees highly managed, and sort of industrialized beekeeping, squeezing the bees to, get that dollar out of them. Whereas in that system, the bees are mostly wild, and the beekeepers are basically taking advantage of them as they can, but without pushing them to the point of developing an unhealthy population, of resulting in a very unhealthy population, which I would characterize our bees are basically a pretty unhealthy population of bees. And so I think that, you know, there's been a lot of interest in this topic. Tom Seeley, for instance, wild beekeeping, a couple people out in the West Coast, Ross Conrad, trying to promote more natural type beekeeping, more beekeeping in keeping with the environment, when keeping with bees existing sort of naturally. And I honestly think there's got to be some balance between us producing honey and using bees for pollination, and also not to their detriment, in trying to help the populations be healthy and also allowing them to be productive, maybe not as productive. They certainly don't make as much honey as we make here, and they don't use bees for pollination there because they have a wild population that does the job. So they don't need to move bees around and manage them industrially like we do. So I think there's a lot to learn there. I think that interestingly enough, you know, we always go over to Africa thinking we're going to teach people stuff. And in reality, for me, it was very much a learning experience. And I think we do have a lot to learn from those bees in that environment. And it's fascinating. And we do a tour to Kenya. I don't know if we're going to do it this year, but we have done it in the last 3 years. We had a wonderful group of beekeepers go over to Kenya and meet beekeepers in Kenya, learn about Kenyan beekeeping, had a fabulous time. I don't know when we'll do it again, but when we do, I'll be sure to let people in the Western North Carolina area know about it.
Oh, that sounds fabulous. Peter, I was going to give Jim the last word. I want him to give us our charge on what he thinks we should do going forward. But I wanted to give you a chance in case anybody else had one last question before I do that.
So well, there's just one comment that I'll say and then one last question. Does that work? Someone said that you guys should check out a documentary about Macedonian beekeepers foraging honey from wild bees, if you haven't seen it. And we had another question that asked if you can crossbreed African and European honeybees.
So yeah, that's been done.
Yeah, that's been done.
In South America. That's the Africanized bee to some degree. But what happened in South America was that the African bee was so much better adapted to the tropics that the European genes are basically bred out of the system. They basically overcame the European bees in a tropical environment because they're much better suited to a tropical environment. In the temperate environment, African bees probably wouldn't do so well because they really don't know how to if you will, in parentheses, how to overwinter. They're not good at surviving long, cold winters. So, you know, I think that crossing of those bees is possible. Certainly, physically, it's possible through artificial insemination. And even hybridization, we've seen it happen. But ultimately, you know, bees left to their own devices, the best bee, you know, it's natural selection, and the best bees, without human intervention, adapt to that particular environment. So somehow we have to, you know, again, it's best, I think, if we can let the bees sort themselves out, if we can do that, if we could manage that. And I think that Macedonian beekeeping movie was Honeyland, and we did see that, and it was fabulous. It absolutely is a fabulous movie, and if anybody who's listening hasn't seen it, you should definitely check it out. It's called Honeyland.
Okay, Jim, give us our marching orders. Inspire us with what we should do to make it a better world. No pressure.
I've always been impressed with people who are beekeepers because they're what we call a diagonal slice of our culture. They span people of all ages and all cultures and all races and all kinds of jobs in our culture. And yet they all are bound by the fascination with these creatures we call honeybees. They're a marvelous way to to appreciate and learn about the complexities of biology and the biological world that we're components of. And I would say that beekeepers as educators are very powerful in recruiting the next generation of beekeepers into the fascinating world of bees. And by talking with those people around you, letting them understand what you know about bees and the special role that they play. And at the same time, as consumers of the food that's produced in our agricultural system, if you have an understanding of the kinds of changes that are needed and are willing to see those changes come about, spending your food dollar wisely and your educational conversations wisely will be the greatest investment in all of our futures that you can make. And I'd encourage you to be forward looking and forward speaking in terms of participating with your fellow human beings.
Okay, I'm back. Thank you, Maryann. Thank you, Jim. And we can't wait to welcome you to Western North Carolina, meet you face to face. We really appreciate your being with us tonight. And thanks to everybody who attended this workshop, this Q&A session. And as I said before, the movie is still available for free until tomorrow night. So you just go to the Asheville Greenworks site and you register there to get your link. And there are 2 more events this week, and the pollinator photo contest is still going on. So jump in there and you might win a fabulous prize. Good night, everybody.
Thank you, fellas.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter.
Bye. Bye, everybody.
Bye. Thanks, Peter.
Thank you.
Guys.